And hello, everybody. Welcome to our second evening lecture. And I'm very happy to introduce and to welcome Professor Richard Newhauser, who is Professor of English and Medieval Studies at the Arizona State University. You know, when you are an organizer of a conference like ours, and we send around a proposal and a call for papers, you are really a little bit nervous and looking for a response. And I think the first response we got from Professor Newhauser, who was excited about the choice of the topic. So we were very pleased, and also our nervosity was calming down, so that we might be on the right track, what we are now sure we are when we are looking back how the conference runs. Yeah, and the special interest in our topic has to do with Professor Newhauser's scholarly interest and work. And we already know him, so he made interventions to our afternoon sessions. And you have to know that there's a time difference of 9 hours between Cologne and Arizona right now. So when he joins us for the earlier sessions, it's very, very early. Yeah, in particular yesterday, when we talked about Peter of Limoges, because he is not only the editor, he is also the translator of this famous work, what was in the center of the one afternoon session. And we discussed on. The second main interest of Professor Newhauser is everything which has to do with virtues, vices, and sin. So he is the expert on virtues, vices, and sin in the Middle Ages. And he had huge research projects to collect even then incipits of Latin works on the vices and virtues, to collect the material, the catalog of Latin texts with material on vices and virtues, and so on, and in vernacular to write a typology on this, and also a lot of interesting collected volumes he produced in making the whole set of this important topic available. And the second thing is indeed to talk about sins. But beside this, he is, for example, also the general editor of the Chaucer encyclopedia in 4 volumes, which is now in preparation. And so, you know, he is a very, very experienced and excellent researcher who got a large number of grants, for example, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. And I think we decided and we agreed that we keep the introductions short and let the speaker speak for himself. And so I step away, and I'm looking forward to the lecture, to the evening lecture this evening. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Speer, and thank you to all of you, and good morning to all of you. Thank you for allowing me to speak in English. As you've heard, I can try German. Sometimes it doesn't come out as I imagined it. So, so first of all, I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope that's clear. Everybody can see that. All right. I do want to mention that I have continued to work on this topic with Professor Edward Peters, professor of medieval history at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did my PhD work. I've divided this presentation into 5 parts. So I'll start with the preliminaries. So I titled this presentation with an echo of Sigmund Freud, not because I intend to draw on psychoanalytic theory necessarily, but because Freud's question enacts the disparities of gender that are central to my theme, while also gesturing at one particular type of curiosity. And if one thing becomes clear from reading medieval texts that mention Curiositas or its vernacular equivalents, especially Latin theological treatises, it is that there is no one phenomenon that these terms designate. Complaints about someone else's Curiositas may amount to a general matter of misdirected epistemology or speculative thinking, but they may also implicate someone's delving into demonology. On the other hand, Curiositas may be grounded more in social trivialities, involving instead of issues of cognition, the lethargic inquisitiveness into someone else's moral state, a willingness to disapprove of someone else's misdeeds, or the careless traffic in rumors that amount to a synecdoche for the vice of avarice, of acedia, excuse me. It makes sense then to specify from the beginning which Curiositas we are diligently pursuing. So here, my main focus will be that Curiositas, which amounts to a statement about the limits of intellectual inquiry. But I hope by looking at this subject through the lens of gender, that I can suggest something about the connection between epistemic curiosity and a socially oriented, externalized, and slothful curiosity. So though I will be focused on assertions in earlier medieval monastic texts about the need to limit intellectual inquiry, I should also clarify that I am very much not an adherent of the Blumenberg hypothesis that curiosity was essentially suppressed in the Middle Ages. Blumenberg's history of speculative curiosity is structured around a familiar liberatory narrative. In a move of self-assertion, modernity is imagined to rehabilitate the concept of speculative curiosity from the various restrictions and prohibitions placed on it during the Middle Ages. It is a narrative of triumphalism, still repeated by those who find the Italian Quattrocento synonymous with the beginnings of modernity. And excuse me, if I try to, oops, okay, there. In a recent book by the astrophysicist Mario Livio, for example, Leonardo da Vinci is examined as an example of limitless curiosity, for he had a mind that was able to push past Galen's views on anatomy, Aristotle's on the physical sciences, and Ptolemy's on the solar system, and all of this because he was decidedly not medieval, It is as if, Livio writes, curiosity had frozen solid during the Middle Ages. As Stephen Greenblatt has also written in a work devoted to this neo-Burkhardian view of history, and this is a work that won many awards, including a Pulitzer Prize in the United States. Something happened in the Renaissance, something that surged up against the constraints that centuries had constructed around curiosity. Greenblatt's book, The Swerve, has been roundly criticized for this kind of oversimplification, which credits Poggio Bracciolini's discovery of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things with marking the point of departure of modernity from a Middle Ages characterized by a lack of pleasure as well as any intellectual curiosity. There is little reason, of course, why Greenblatt should evaluate pleasure only in physical terms, even among avowed Epicureans, or think that pleasure only, think that pleasure was ultimately stifled everywhere in the Middle Ages. Although The Swerve has at times been critiqued as an aberration in the author's more measured view of intellectual curiosity before the Italian Renaissance, it is in fact all of a piece with his earlier scholarship. His analysis of Mandeville's travels, for example, published by him first in 1991, concludes that this work appears to be a medieval example of speculative curiosity. And he might have said the same about Marco Polo's The Description of the World. In Greenblatt's analysis, Mandeville's travels does not present an epistemological break with the priority of Christian belief, nor is it truly, nor can it be truly subversive. But he also emphasizes that it cannot be taken as a work that intends to satisfy a wide reading audience's keen interest to know about the unexplored world, the unexplored parts of the world. And Greenblatt appeals to only one study to support the view that a curiosity about beliefs and customs unknown in medieval Europe must surely have been heterodox at the time, namely Hans Blumenberg's Die Legitimität der Neuzeit. My assumption is, however, precisely that texts like Mandeville's travels and the description of the world demonstrate the legitimacy of what we might call an anthropological curiosity in the later Middle Ages, a widespread desire to know about the varieties of humanity that is testified to in the popularity of these travel texts and others like them. So as I wrote some time ago, there is certainly a mala curiositas in the Middle Ages, there is certainly a bona curiositas, and there is certainly a media curiositas without moral strictures. On the other hand, a figure who wanders in a frivolous pursuit to see something new can indeed help criticize and can indeed help crystallize the early gendering of one aspect of the limits of inquiry in the monastic tradition. So we are helped in thinking about the process of gendering by the work of Judith Butler. Specifically, her theory of gender performativity makes clear how gender exists separately from sex and is a product of culture rather than an inherently biological aspect of identity that becomes so naturalized as to be thought of as tied to sex. But Butler does not mean that gender is simply an act or a type of dramatic performance. It is rather performative in the sense that it is culturally constructed through the enactment of an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts, or at least asserted to be so by others as a way to constitute this identity. That is to say that the process of female gendering occurs within and as an expression of the realms of masculinities, hegemonic as well as subordinated, that include in this case the masculinity of monastic establishments. It is here that we find the context in which the earliest female gendering of Curiositas is expressed in monastic legislation and the exegesis of the figure of Dinah from the book of Genesis. Part 2, Dinah. Dinah is mentioned in Genesis chapter 30, verse 21, as the daughter of Jacob and Leah. We do not see her again until Jacob has bought a field near the city of Shechem. At that point, chapter 34, verse 1, Dinah goes out to see the women of the country and is seen in turn by Shechem, the son of the local prince, who carries her off and rapes her. Jacob's sons are outraged. They demand that if Shechem wants to marry their sister, all the men of Shechem must be circumcised. This is agreed to, but on the third day after circumcision, two of Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, go to the city and kill all the men and retrieve their sister. That's chapter 34, verses 25 to 26. So later, in the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux will find sinful curiosity reprehensible for the effects it has on others, as well as on the sinner. And he will explain in three great examples that he will use that Satan's crime led to all the other sins of mankind, and Eve's to original sin. But the infectious quality of the sin of curiosity is made most apparent in the figure of Dinah. Verbally, at least, Dinah will reflect the earlier monastic tradition, for he finds in her a curiosa ociositas vel ociosa curiositas that brought destruction on itself and others around it, friend and foe alike. Furthermore, while Dinah went out to see the women of Shechem through her idle curiosity, she was looked at with an even greater degree of useless curiosity. The misery of her sin belonged both to her and to those who were urged by her behavior into the same sin. Bernard's interpretation of Dinah will be something new in the history of the sin, for it asserts the evil both of making a spectacle of oneself, thus arousing the excessive curiosity of others, and of one's own engagement in a sinful curiositas that drives the mind away from itself and beyond its legitimate boundaries and interests. Bernard is the first to see Dinah's curiositas as both a sin and the cause of a sin. He will draw attention in this way not only to the curiosi themselves, but to the harm they do to others. This particular idea will have further implications for later analyses of the sin, but all of this is still in the future. The first step was to bring Dina within the orbit of Curiositas criticism altogether. The understanding of curiosity as a vice by Pope Gregory the Great formed a regular component in the early medieval analysis of the concept. The influence of Gregory the Great's analysis of Curiositas can be remarked in a wide range of literature, but Gregory's exegesis of certain biblical figures, such as that of Dina, was also adapted from other contexts for use in the prescription of evil curiosity. The earliest writer I know of to use this figure from the Bible in an argument against dangerous curiositas was Jonas, the Bishop of Orleans, in his De Institutione Laicali. Jonas's work was not written for the monastery, but it reflects monastic concerns nonetheless. In supporting his use of Dina, at any rate, Jonas referred specifically to her appearance in Gregory the Great's Cura Pastoralis. Here, Gregory employed the biblical episode allegorically to warn against being overconfident in the work of mercy. Just as Shechem comforted Dina after raping her, so does the devil give the sinner a false hope of forgiveness after seducing him into sin. Gregory's words served as the background for Jonas's interpretation, but it was really the latter who drew Dina into the theme of Curiositas. For Jonas, she was an image of the mind that had neglected its own interests and had become thoroughly absorbed by the actions of others. Haymo, monk of Auxerre, again reflecting the monastic analysis of sinful curiositas, repeated the same idea. When Dina went out from her father's home, she receded from herself. And when her virginity was violated, Haymo told the reader, this showed the curiosus falling into the very vices for which he had reproached others more harshly than was fitting. What lies behind this catapulting of Dina as a figure of womankind altogether into the Curiositas debate? In the history of biblical exegesis, any sign of sudden or suddenly increased interest in a previously neglected or tangentially treated figure or problem usually suggests that some interest outside exegesis itself is driving the exegete. Although one cannot deduce from a new interest in Dina exegesis alone a distinctively Carolingian concern for the vices attributable distinctively to women, the discussion of Dina by Jonas and Haymo, so different from that of Gregory the Great, while at the same time referring to that of Gregory, suggests that Carolingian clerical concerns about Curiositas had begun to range widely beyond the male monastic figures on which they had hitherto focused. So here are a few categorical assertions about the gendering of our subject that can be drawn from the material examined so far and from further background material that I have written on in the past. First, there is no reference in classical, late classical, or post-classical texts in Greek, Hebrew, or Latin, learned or popular, that implies that curiosity is a trait in any way more characteristic of women than men, or indeed in any way characteristic of women at all. And I hasten to add that I will be happy to learn more about Arabic texts, which I hope to hear about perhaps in the discussion or in emails. So I look forward to that. In any case, Pandora and Pandora's box will not suffice. She is never mentioned in the discussion of limits to intellectual inquiry before the modern period. And Psyche is a creation of Apuleius, who thematized Curiositas in the Golden Ass. Again, that's an example, or she is an example who is never really mentioned in the discussion of Curiositas. Second, there is no reference to curiosity on the part of Eve and Adam in exegesis of Genesis by Jewish or Christian interpreters until the 4th century, and perhaps not until the work of Bede. And even after the virtuoso uses of Augustine, Curiositas continued to be a vice almost exclusively attributed to men. Third, these two statements hold true even in the face of a general and amply documented tradition of pagan, Jewish, and Christian misogyny. The tradition of misogyny is palpably apparent, but Curiositas was not a part of it, at least not before the early Middle Ages. So these statements apply to the full range of phenomena designated by the relevant terms, from what might be called speculative or Faustian curiosity to excessive nosiness of the sort taken for granted, for example, by Valmont in letter 21 of Les Liaisons Dangereuses. I'm quoting him here. Here I must render justice to my Madame de Tourvel. No doubt she regretted the order she had given, and not having the strength to conquer her curiosity, she had at least enough to oppose my desire. For a moment I feared she might countermand her orders, and that her delicacy might harm me. I reckoned without the curiosity of a woman, and so I was wrong. So, okay, this is a trivial example, offhandedly stated as if it were the most obvious truism of in the world. But it is precisely because of these characteristics, which were probably believed even by Madame de Tourvel, that Valmont's observation is interesting. When did people start to think like this? Or, because we are, after all, scholars of curiosity, and the reality we seek to discover lies in sources, when do we have evidence that people had started to think like this? And what kind of evidence is it? What will it and what will it not tell us? As is clear from the long history of Curiositas, the speculative and nosy aspects of Curiositas are related, each side coloring the other, and up to the monasticization of moral theology following Gregory the Great, and to a large extent after that as well, Curiositas was a male vice. Like other vices, Curiositas was transmitted through time and in texts, chiefly in monastic sources concerned largely with the inner workings of the monastic life. I have traced it in a few publications, from Isidore through Bede and the Carolingians to Anselm of Canterbury and down to the Cistercians, in particular Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the greatest virtuosi on the subject of monastic curiosity. Not surprisingly, the Cassianic sense of monastic curiositas as a languorous nosiness and rumor mongering tended to prevail over the more complex and varied Augustinian sense until the work of Anselm of Canterbury. Thus, when the great Carolingian reform of monasticism in favor of Benedictine monasticism finally got underway at the end of the 8th century, the contours of moral theology were well laid out, and they were essentially male, but not for long. Carolingian reform legislation on the lives of female religious and a new exegetical interest in a neglected biblical narrative constitute the most important evidence for the 9th century female gendering of slothful Curiositas. Part 3, monastic legislation. The Carolingians, of course, did not invent the regulation of the lives of women religious. There is much of this type of literature in the work of Augustine and in the letters of Jerome, as well as in the Regula of Caesarius of Arles and in Caesarius's letters and sermons. Yet in this earlier literature, Curiositas plays almost no role at all, and concupiscentia oculorum a small and routine one. In Caesarius's letter to his sister and the women religious with her, the well-known Varior, he indeed cites 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 16, and the phrase concupiscentia oculorum, but here the vice designated by this phrase refers to the desires for luxuries and vanity. In the Regula itself, this concupiscentia is identified with responding to the glances of men. As far as I am aware, there is no other change in this sense of concupiscentia oculorum in the later 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. Cassian's mentor, Evagrius Ponticus, had advised women religious not to concern themselves, and the Greek word is periagaze, with their sisters' lives, nor to take delight in the misfortunes of their sisters, thus conveying a sense of curiositas that was applied to women in a way identical to that in which it was applied to men. When Carolingian reformers turned their attention to women religious in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, at the Council of Frankfurt in 794, that of Chalon-sur-Saône in 813, and especially that of Aachen in 816, they first insisted that women religious live according to a rule, that the Regula Benedicti be rigorously applied to them, that they be cloistered, and that their houses be subordinated to the authority of bishops. As Suzanne Wempel and others have pointed out, these reforms served to transform Merovingian religious sentiment and style. Among the most significant products of the Council of Aachen were what their editor, Albert Werminghoff, calls duo codices, the Institutio Canonicorum Aquis Granensis, consisting of 145 canons governing the conduct of male religious, and the Institutio Sanctimonialium Aquis Granensis, consisting of 28 canons governing the lives and conduct of female religious. In 2 canons of the latter document, we find the first attribution of curiositas to women, not as in the texts of Evagrius and Caesarius mentioned already, to women in the same way as they were applied to male religious, but distinctively to women as the femineos sexos. Canon 14 of the Institutio Sanctimonialium treats the ways by which the abbess should provide spiritual sustenance to the nuns in her charge. Just as she has had to provide her charges with necessitates corporum, so should she provide them with documenta virtutum in vita moribus actu habitu, seeing to it that they receive not only good examples to follow, but that they emphatically do not have the occasion to observe bad examples. They are to be taught how to avoid pride, the radix omnium malorum, as well as avarice, envy, hate, detractions, murmurings, whispers, scurrilities, bilinguitates, that is duplicity, dissensions, simulationes, that is deceptions, vanas verborum confabulationes, that is empty conversations, and similar things which will lead to their ruin. With no less vigor, they should also avoid curiositates quibus femineosexus potissimum implicator, curiosities with which The female sex above all is involved. Ignoring their own vices, they should not investigate curiously the vices of others, heeding the words of Jerome. It should suffice, he said, that each sinner repent her own and not carp at the sins of others. In Canon 18, the abbess is warned against letting nuns fall into what is clearly an etymological echo of Curiosities' origins, namely desidia atque incuria, that is idleness or a lack of care, particularly since the feminine is known to be the sexus fragilior. Further, in Canon 18, which is devoted to the correction of erring nuns, the offenses and vices listed earlier in Canon 14 are repeated with several additions, including the offense of discordiam inter sorore seminare, sowing discord among the sisters. So as Verminghoff's editorial note tells us, the last phrase comes from the book of Proverbs, and it leads to a second point about the use of Curiositas in the Institutio Sanctimonialium. Proverbs 6:19 is indeed the source of our phrase, but in the Vulgate, the phrase reads, et eum qui seminat inter fratres discordias. What the canon has done is simply to adapt to women a text that originally and lately applied to men. That this is not merely grammatical housekeeping is suggested by a brief consideration of the Institutio Canonicorum, the male counterpart to the Institutio Sanctimonialium. It is one of the striking features of the Institute for Canons that, in spite of its prominence and its length, quite unlike virtually every other document pertaining to male monastic discipline of which I am aware, it nowhere mentions Curiositas as a moral danger to canons. Chapters 123 and 134 in the Institutio Canonicorum correspond to canons 14 and 18 in the Institutio Sanctimonialium, and there is a list of characteristic vices in the concluding canon 145 of the Institutio Canonicorum, but nowhere is discordia inter fratres mentioned at all. Thus, not only does the Institutio Sanctimonialium appropriate and apply to women as women in the most general terms the vitium curiositatis, hitherto almost exclusively a male vice, but for the occasion of Anno 816, the corresponding disciplinary text for men pointedly does not mention Curiositas, although the Curiositas of male religious is discussed in Smaragdus's Diadema Monachorum of the same year. Granted that male Curiositas certainly exists in Carolingian literature, on the occasion of the year 816, it has been temporarily attributed exclusively to women religious. If the Institutio Sanctimonialium had been our only piece of evidence, the case would be weaker, but it would still be a case. And I could at least have asserted that female curiosity was originally male curiosity applied to women religious by overzealous Carolingian monastic reformers. There is, however, a bit more evidence. Conciliar legislation is one kind of evidence, scriptural exegesis is another, and there need be no natural fit between them. But for a period like the early 9th century, a conjunction between two such different kinds of sources is persuasive. So, part 4, exegesis. From Augustine on, the figure of Eve in the exegesis of Genesis had often been cited as an example of female curiositas, but not very intensely. Eve's disobedience was the chief focus of Augustine's exegesis, disobedience, as Elaine Pagels has demonstrated. Moreover, no early exegete of Genesis had paid any attention to Dinah, who, as noted already, went out to visit the women of the country and was raped. Gregory the Great had mentioned only that the story warned against overconfidence, Jonas of Orleans, then in a kind of handbook of Christian ethics for laymen on the occasion of his marriage, had in fact mentioned Dina, as noted in chapter 28, De Curiositate. The entire chapter is on the topic. And he offered the first detailed exegesis of Dina. Although Jonas claimed Gregory the Great as his model, his exegesis is far more elaborate than anything Gregory had written on Dina, and with a much different focus. Moreover, Jonas includes many of the texts from Defensor's Liber Scintillarum, chapter 30. And although he speaks of Dina as the mind that goes away from itself and reminds his readers that canons and monks, as well as lay people, are prone to this sin, he opens up a new topos in exegesis that has as its center the unheeding young woman who represents one type of Curiositas more effectively than any other figure in Scripture. Indeed, Jonas's focus on Dina strongly influenced not only Bernard of Clairvaux much later, but also the exegetes who immediately followed him. Sermo 112 for the third Sunday after Pentecost is attributed to Remigius in Patrologia Latina 118, but to Haymo of Auxerre by more recent critical scholarship. The theme of the sermon is Luke 14. That is the story of the man who offered a banquet and was rejected by those he had invited. And Haymo commented on the guest who had purchased 5 yoke of oxen and had to test them, so he couldn't come to the banquet. This becomes a topos for the moral dangers involved potentially in the 5 external senses in exegesis since Origen and Ambrose, and one particularly identified with Curiositas by Augustine and many others after him. Haymo identifies concupiscentio colorum with Curiositas, quotes Gregory the Great, and then offers the episode of Dina as an example of the mens curiosae perscrutatur. Leaving her home and, importantly, the supervision of men, she is the cause of her own rape and the slaughter of Shechem, of Shechem's father, and of all the males of their land because of the shame she has brought upon her fathers. This is a text that would, I suggest, appeal in a distinctive way to 9th century hearers, whether they were interested in the figurative senses of Scripture or not. On the literal level, after all, the story is, among other things, the tale of a rape, followed by a proposed marriage and the slaughter of an entire clan, a phenomenon not completely unknown to and with considerable resonance in Carolingian Europe. Haymo was followed by Remigius, and the tradition that Jonas and they had begun ran down through the study of Scripture and its exegesis to Bernard and to Bernard's protege, Galland of Vreny, whose De Colloquio Viciorum offers a dramatic portrait of Curiositas, this time not entirely an allegorized personification, but a real Dame Curiositas. So if you're looking for a figure of a personified curiosity who battles, at least verbally, with other vices to see who's the most destructive, Galland of Vreny's text provides it. And it is a feminine, a female personification. Yet it is precisely the figurative interpretation of Dina which reemerges after the 10th century, perhaps because of the new focus of Reformed monasticism on the interior life of the monk and the monastic community. For Jonas and Haymo, the figure of Dina may indeed have meant the mind that had neglected its own interests and had become absorbed by the actions of others, but they chose to create a new exegesis of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, to accomplish this. A 9th century Carolingian reading of this feud from Genesis had many contemporary resonances, and moral allegory was only one of them. Dinah may represent the mind indeed, but she represents a Carolingian monastic reformer's view of the mind and of women as suitable representations of this kind of flawed and slothfully wandering mind, a view perfectly consistent with the outlook of the Institutio Sanctimonialium and of other strands of Christian misogyny, although the latter had not earlier focused on Curiositas. The argument I have just advanced, namely that Curiositas first became applied to women as a distinctive female vice during the Carolingian monastic reforms of the first quarter of the 9th century, and that Jonas's and Haymo's novel Dinah exegesis was influenced by what some of the most influential texts of the Reform movement said about women religious, is supported not only by these texts themselves, but by the absence of any such application in any earlier known text from the pagan or Christian past. Thus, the Carolingian texts are distinctive not only in themselves, but in contrast to everything that had gone before. So quantitatively, these are two types of texts. It would be great if we had more, but this is what we have. Part 5, the conclusion. To sum up, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin antiquity do not provide evidence of any form of curiosity as a vice attributed to women generally. The antique and early Christian strands of misogyny from Juvenal, Paul, the pastoral epistles, Jerome, and the male ascetic movement indeed create a graphic and wide-ranging literature of female vice, but this literature did not include Curiositas. Indeed, speculative Curiositas theoretische Neugierde remained a male vice and continued to do so after the 9th century, especially as Curiositas moved into the halls of the university. That the Institutio Sanctimonialium of 816 listed as vices to be avoided or corrected in women religious, a conventional group of vices that hitherto had been discussed largely in the context of male religious life, cannot be doubted. So the first conclusion is that the Curiositas quibo sexus femineus potissimum implicator is by and large the old Cassianic Curiositas about another's sins and neglect of one's own. No one before 816 had ever suggested that it was a particularly feminine vice or female vice. And to do so suggests that the entire narrative context of Dinah's story is also agentive here, that she performs a gender curiosity in a way that is sexualized as female and brutally revenged in a way that instantiates a hegemonic masculinity. The immorality of slothful curiosity is made all the more abhorrent in that it is cast as in need of rescue by male violence. Second, it is true that Dinah had always been the daughter of Leah and Jacob and had always lived and suffered in Genesis 34. And it is also true that for Jonas of Orleans, she signifies a certain abstract category of mind. One must nevertheless ask why Jonas, who is the first exegete of Genesis to do anything at all about Dinah, why that is so, and that following him, Haymo and Remigius do also, thus leading to the extensive attention paid to Dinah by Bernard of Clairvaux. I cannot prove that there was a tertium quid behind the Institutio and slightly later Dinah exegesis, but Wempel thinks there was a distinctively Carolingian misogyny that was different from the commonplace Christian misogyny of the ascetic tradition, and that may indeed be so. One may not be inclined to split hairs about misogyny, but if one does, one learns more precise things and comes up with at least plausible explanations to questions that have no other obvious answers. From the first half of the 9th century, then, the road lay open to the elaboration of female curiositas in exegesis, in exempla, in moral theology, to the work of Bernard and Galland of Reny, John Bunyan, Valmont, but also Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland is the greatest curiosa of modern literature. The history of curiositas as a female characteristic, in other words, is not entirely a vicious or a dismal history, as Alice reminds us, but its beginning is, and that is the part of the story I have tried to describe here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very great evening lecture, and to making us a witness in your inquiry into the genering of this key term of our conference, curiosity, and how this happened very close in the sources. So thank you very much. I'm looking around here in the audience. If there are questions, there are opportunities. Yeah, David Wilmer, I see.
Yeah, I have a question concerning the background of sources you considered. If I understood you correctly, you included in your thesis that there is no such link to female curiosity before the Carolingian time, also the Hebrew sphere. But there is evidence of this in the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, so the Midrash to Genesis, which dates approximately from the time of the Jerusalem Talmud, so fourth century perhaps. There's the story of God deciding from what member of Adam to create Eve, and he doesn't want to create her from the eyes so that she should not become curious. And then he recognizes, although I didn't create her from the eyes, she became curious. And the Midrash cites a passage in Isaiah to confirm this. So at least in the Hebrew tradition from the, say, 4th century, there is this link in existence.
Right. Thank you. And I did say that Eve is here and there mentioned as curious. What's the Hebrew terminology that's used in Midrash Rabbah?
Sakranit.
Say again, please.
Sakranit.
Okay, so yeah, indeed, that that is so. I thank you for pointing that out. I will slightly modify my thesis, and I'm happy to do so. As far as I know, and perhaps you're going to correct this, but for Dinah, nothing like that. Sakranut is not at all used, and very infrequently anywhere in Midrash, or in Talmudic texts. So, it's not, and even where you might expect it, in the stricture, for example, if you're studying if you're studying a text of Talmud, you shouldn't look to the left or the right, even if you see a beautiful tree. curiosity is not part of that at all. It's just the need for concentration, right? So I think that, you know, yes, here and there, Eve gets tied in with curiosity, but not very often, and that's certainly not the dominant tradition. But you know, thank you very much, and I will. You can expect an email from me.
Okay.
Robert, ne? Und dann Pavel, ne? Pavel?
Pavel ruhig zuerst.
Ach so, ja.
Ja,
Pavel.
ja, hallo, ja.
Hallo, Pavel.
Hello. All right. Well, thank you very much for this absolutely fascinating paper. Listening to you, I was thinking of an article I read some time ago by Mireille Vincent Cassis with a very eloquent title, Quand les femmes deviennent paresseuses. And Vincent Cassis shows in this article how laziness becomes a gendered vice. If I remember right, her main sources are from the 12th century. And I was just wondering if perhaps your story about curiosity becoming a gendered vice could be part of a larger process of the gendering of virtues and vices as we move on in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think that makes very good sense. And you know, we really, I think, should keep in mind that the potential for doing this was there since Prudentius, where all of the vices, although of course all of the virtues as well, are female. So, and yet they're not applied that way. And it is only then in the early Middle Ages where this, I think, this process begins, certainly with Curiositas. It's interesting, of course, as well, that Curiositas, you know, was never obviously a member of the 7 deadly sins, or not one of the 7, but it was distributed among many of them. So obviously pride, if you're thinking of Satan's sin of curiosity, as I said, sloth or acedia, that we see that already in Cassian, but also gluttony, anything where we can say the mechanistic or physical aspect of cura, this etymological part of Curiositas plays a role, and where excessive cura is applied to something, as we heard in an earlier presentation today, a too much effort is given and recognized as too much, then that can be seen as a mala curiositas. And so Gregory the Great considers taking too much effort to cook your food, spicing it too much, that is the curiositas of gluttony. Okay, so everywhere along the line there are potentials in all of this to gender these aspects as particular roles became much more gendered in medieval Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. We heard a lot about Carolingians, what made me especially happy today, but I think you focused on Carolingians after 816 mainly. But shouldn't we differentiate a bit more between Carolingians before and after 816? As far as I know,
at the court of Charlemagne, around the circle of Alcuin, there was a much more liberal attitude towards curiosity in general, even positively connotated. We have this in Alcuin's letters, in his school dialogues. And only after Charlemagne had died in 814 and Louis the Pious took over, there is to be observed a general change in the attitude towards curiosity, not only in the female gender type, but as well, of course, in the female gender type. But I think this female gendered curiosity could be regarded as a detail or maybe a focus in a greater movement, in a change towards a general consideration of curiosity as a vice. Could you confirm that in any way?
I have to go back to my sources and take a look. I don't see that, offhand thinking about this, that you see the kind of gendering earlier. So that, I guess, would confirm what you have suggested, and in Carolingian texts. And certainly there is positive curiosity. Not often does it use the term Curiositas, though, okay, which, got really a bad reputation thanks to Augustine and Apuleius. Well, Augustine's reading Apuleius as well, but so it takes a special effort to consider Curiositas positive, first of all. And I don't know that it's used that way in, let us say, pre-Louis the Pious texts. It's certainly used negatively in those texts, though. Again, I don't see that it's especially gendered.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, are there further questions? I look here to my team. No? Not yet, but yeah, so then let me close this evening lecture. Let me close the two-day sessions. And yeah, normally under normal circumstances, we would have taken our evening speaker out for lunch or to a reception together with the audience. This we are really missing. I hope that we can invite you sometime when we can practice those social skills, practical skills also after such a wonderful evening lecture, which really needs to be thought about and talked about later in persona. So thank you very much for this evening lecture again, Professor Newhauser, and thank you very much for all of you attending the second day of the Kölner Mediaevistentagung. We are back at 11 in the morning, but our time, I think, is 2 o'clock in the night in Arizona. Yeah, and then we start again. And yeah, once again, have a nice evening and have a good day.
Ich bedanke mich bei Ihnen allen auch. Also.
Danke sehr.